Welcome to our study of the way of the Bodhisattva with the commentary by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which we have here in a book called the Bodhisattva Guide, which has actually gone through a few rebirths. This teaching, which is essentially translation of His Holiness's teaching in Dordogne, I think sometime in the 1980s or 90s. Maybe 90s, huh? Anyway, this was first published as Lightning in the Dark of the Night, I think. And then it was published as For the Benefit of All Beings. And now it's called the Bodhisattva Guide, but behind these titles, it's the same work, the commentary. So we'll begin with the opening chants. Abandon evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. Like a star, an optical illusion or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning or a cloud. So should one consider all compounded things. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. So presently, we're in the 8th chapter of the Way of the Bodhisattva. And in the 8th chapter, we're particularly in the section then, which is essentially referred to as exchanging self and others. And the point that's being made here is essentially that as long as we're still caught up in our concern for ourselves, then on one hand, we're not having fun. We're essentially creating suffering. So there's on a conventional level an entire experience of discomfort, but also as it constitutes then a cognitive obscuration in that there's still this belief in a self and a constructing of other. This is then what we refer to as duality. There's a complete oblivion and ignorance with regard to our own true nature and the nature of reality. So there's simply this inability to see clearly that holds us in samsara and all the sufferings that come from that. And just in the context of this chapter, we've looked at some verses that many of us probably would have come across just in their Buddhist studies. Notably 129, where it says, all the joy the world contains has come through wishing happiness for others. All the misery the world contains has come from wanting pleasure for oneself. Is there need for lengthy explanation? Childish beings look out for themselves. Buddhas labor for the good of others. See the difference that divides them. So the beauty of this is that this is not bland. This is not predictable spirituality where you're sort of just encouraged to sort of tune in to some greater, more lovely reality. This is actually based on hard investigation into the facts of our direct, verifiable experience, and being willing to actually acknowledge that a shift is needed here. So here, just picking up from where His Holiness commented last time, where we ended, he says, having examined all that is wrong with considering ourselves more important than others, and having seen all the harm that such an attitude brings, we should revolt against its domination and never let the thought of our own importance influence us. So that's where you could say gullibly or naively, we've been submitted to some patterns of thinking and patterns of attitude and patterns of belief, which of course is in some way justifiable because this is very common. And so we have, you could say, a whole discourse that we're situated within that sustains that naive belief. But this is where we're actually encouraged, and that's where the Buddha is actually saying, try and look who's ruling you. You know, just like just like Marx and Engels, they sort of talk to the proletariat and said, look how you're being, you know, manipulated, exploited. You know, you should revolt against the repression. And similarly, also, you know, the general revolts that we see around the world, they come from actually seeing how there's suffering that's unnecessary because it's being imposed by agencies or powers that actually have no justification. So that's where we similarly should revolt against this domination, where we gullibly submit, kowtow to this habitual idea of ourselves as being important. And this is not about us just sort of becoming goody two-shoes and just thinking about being selfless. This is like far more involved than just a sort of a little bit of a sweet sort of sentiment of, oh, I'd like to be a nice person to others. It's about really getting to the bottom of fundamental ignorance. And that's not easy. And that's why if we look at in Buddhist cultures, we can see that nobody ever expects this to be easy. And that's why there's a whole culture of investigation, analysis, study to begin with. And then there's a whole practice, which is then the practice of the path, which takes an enormous application. So that's where what we are talking about here is no sort of trivial matter, but at the same time, it lies really at the heart of what really is the most important thing for us and us, everybody around us, which is happiness, which is well-being. And in a way, our sanity speaks to us from within, demanding happiness and being not happy when things going, creating unhappiness, and having an appreciation for when the conditions of happiness is there. And we can actually see that when we actually follow through with what we're speaking about here, we can see we begin to align ourselves more with reality, and as a consequence also experience greater happiness. So then Shantideva says, 170, let every thought of working for yourself be utterly rejected, cast aside. Now that you've been sold to others, stop your whining, be of service. For if, through being inattentive, I do not deliver you to others, you will hand me over, it is certain, to the guards and janitors of hell. So it is that if I want contentment, I should never seek to please myself. And likewise, if I want to guard myself of others, I should always, likewise, if I wish to guard myself of others, I should always be the guard. So this is where, at this point, we've actually made some solid argumentation. So at this point, we can actually go ahead and just, you know, be pretty blunt. The deception is only too obvious at this point. There's no need to sort of pussyfoot in terms of making some gentle assertions and nudge us a little bit in a sort of a more, you could say, creative way of thinking. We've actually done that. And at this point, it really just comes down to us making a firm decision and actually being consistent what we now on the basis of reason can see. And then at that point, there's quite clear that the whole project of self-centering is entirely futile, it is entirely destructive, and it only is counterproductive in terms of our own happiness. So that's where we are saying here, this idea is something we just should completely give up. We now, very bluntly, we're the property of others. So at this point, we just zip it, stop the whining, and we're there fully, service of others. And then Shantideva again, he then uses this style, which is talking to himself, where he says, you know, talking to his egocentric, habitual, narrow self. And that's where he's onto the narrow self. And he says, if I'm not really onto you, you know, if I don't really make sure that you're actually, you know, you've been sold to others here on the the market, and now you belong to others. If I don't make sure that you're actually, you know, tagging along with this, if you're not completely involved, then what will happen if I allow you to get your ignorant ways? Then you're going to hand me over to what essentially brings about suffering, the guards and janitors of hell. So that's where, if it is that I want to be happy, the secret is, and what we've then seen in this chapter, the secret does not lie in pleasing myself. And at this point, we actually, as modern Buddhists, we have to be completely understanding what we mean here. And this doesn't mean that all of a sudden we begin to become self-deprecating. It doesn't mean that we become martyrs, doormats. It doesn't mean that we're not having self-compassion. There's not any conflict with any of that. So we need to a little bit sort of rise up above the sort of sometimes slightly unimaginative discourses that problematize what is being said here and thinks it has to do with something that you could say psychologically unhealthy. There's no conflict with, yes, there is implicitly here self-compassion. There is implicitly here, there's no danger of becoming a doormat. There's no danger of us all of a sudden falling into something that is in any way unhealthy. If we, again, like Shantideva has said before, you know, look how sentient beings they do, look how Buddhas they do, and try and look at the difference. So that's where we look at the sages and we can see, hey, they are actually onto something. And then if we were to say, wonder what it is, well, this is it. And so this is where he says, if I wish to guard myself, it's of the others. I should always be the guard. If I wish to look out for myself, I should be looking out for others. So then Shantideva stresses particularly the dangers of being attached to one's body. He says, to the extent this human form is cosseted and saved from hurt, just so, to that degree, it dwindles to a weak and fretful state. For those who sink to such a pass, the earth and all it holds are powerless to satisfy, for who can give them all they crave? So again, here I think this is again where we've already sort of done the, you could say, argumentation, but this is sort of taking it into a place where we're just really clear on the point that's being made, and that is exactly the extent to we begin looking out for our own body. To that extent, it actually becomes weak. Now, we're not, again, please don't think that anybody's suggesting you shouldn't eat well, exercise well, you know, all of that. But there's a neurotic degree to which we actually fall into a sort of hedonistic, you could say, pampering ourselves. And that's where we can see that even though we nowadays, we operate within, again, a whole cultural discourse that is all about pampering ourselves. And there's a whole economy that actually depends on, you know, the whole population of, you know, the first world sort of pampering themselves. Apart from that, then we can see that when this goes into overdrive and individuals are sort of beginning to just overly pamper themselves, there's also a weakness. There's a psychological sense of fragility that begins to become accentuated, and the sort of the habitual wish for comfort. If we just go with that, you know, the whole sort of thing, then we fall apart. And that's where, of course, also within our conventional logic, we know we need exercise, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to look out for ourselves. And all of that actually extends beyond our ordinary comfort. But the point here is that if we just tag along with the self-centering, then we really diminish and degenerate. So that's where we can see that if we just give the self everything it would want, we'd completely go to bits. So that's where there's no end to the craving then. And this is not something that we talk about in the context of yoga or fitness or diet. It's also something that's reflected in literature and the arts, where we have countless stories and narratives about the downfall of excess. It's a classical theme. So His Holiness says, attachment to the body can only bring us suffering. If we cherish it because it's useful to us, then we should regard everyone else's bodies in the same way, because their bodies are useful to them. So fair enough, if we're looking out for ourselves, that's good, that's excellent. But then also we should be also attentive that others also equally, and there's a lot more of the others than there are of ourselves, they also, their bodies are useful to them. So that's, we're talking about everybody around us, from the ants to the humans to the rodents, fish, what have you. 184. Therefore, free from all attachment, I will give this body for the benefit of beings, and though it is afflicted by so many faults, I shall adopt it as my necessary tool. So sometimes in the discussion of the practice of chud, we highlight how the thing we are most attached to is the body, and that's where we, in the practice of chud, we simply just psychologically think in terms of going beyond the ordinary hopes and fears we have around our our body and our person, that we simply give it up. Here, the emphasis is more on actually that we're offering this body as a vehicle for the benefit of others. So presently, we have a body, we have speech, we have mind, and this we're putting to the service of others. So we might say, well, you know, I just have a karmically constructed body. I don't have the body of a sage or a, you know, all the, you could say the perfect body. No, but still, we can, you know, it might be imperfect, but nevertheless, it's a very useful tool. And we actually can use this body then as a vehicle for benefiting others. So His Holiness says, until now, we have let ourselves be dominated by our clinging to I. It is high time we put a stop to this childish behavior by following in the footsteps of the Bodhisattvas, recalling the instructions on carefulness and warding off dullness and sleep. Like those compassionate heirs of the conquerors, meaning the Bodhisattvas, we should patiently practice day and night. If we can do this, it is certain our suffering will one day come to an end. So we might look to the Bodhisattvas as sort of superhumans, but that's not the point. These are just individuals who have done what makes sense. And as a result, then, yes, they sort of rise above, but it's not as if they possess anything that we don't. And the instructions we have here in terms of the practice of the Bodhisattva is essentially just the do it yourself. This is how you do it. Instruction on how to do exactly like they do. And as a result, then, it says here, then it's certain our suffering will one day come to an end. 187. Thus, to banish all obscuring veils, I'll bend my mind from the mistaken path, and constantly upon the perfect object, I shall rest my mind in even meditation. So, with the clarity that comes from reasoning, critical thinking, making a clear cut from the ordinary causes of suffering, and identifying where the both emotional and cognitive obscurations come from, namely the discursive dualistic mind, and our distracted feeding this habitual pattern, then we decide this, what we need to do is then provide the conditions for this mind to extract itself from this unconscious, mindless insanity and crazed condition. And that's where we then practice meditation, simply as a way of allowing the mind to find its way back to its innate, natural, luminous condition. So that's where we then say, resting upon the perfect object, not in the dualistic sense, but just in terms of resting in the undiluted condition. Then Shantideva says, I shall rest my mind in even meditation. So this concludes the chapter on meditation. And of course, what we have here is really a very condensed, not very, but somewhat condensed presentation of the way of the Bodhisattva. So of course, we're just selecting a few. His Holiness has selected a few essential points. But Of course, the text itself is rather long. I think there's like 1,000 stanzas in its entirety. And also there are some excellent commentaries available to us in English. I think I mentioned a few times the commentary, one of which His Holiness himself refers to, which is Khenpo Kunzang Palden. His commentary is called The Nectar Speech of Manjushri. And this commentary is based on Paltar Rinpoche, who was famous for teaching the way of the Bodhisattva, and His Holiness also refers to in the introduction to Paltar Rinpoche's tradition of commentary. So this is very much what he's following, as well as also someone called Minyak Kunzang Sonam, who was a great master of the Gelug tradition, His Holiness's own tradition, but who then also became a student of Paltar Rinpoche. So these two masters have written some significant commentaries on the way of the Bodhisattva. So these are actually available in English. Now we come to the wisdom chapter. Shantideva says, all these branches of the doctrine, the enlightened sage expounded for the sake of wisdom. Therefore, they must cultivate this wisdom, who wish to have an end to suffering. So wisdom we could define as that which cuts through deception. If you look up wisdom in places like Merriam-Webster or so forth, then you would see wisdom is very often described in terms of the accumulation of experience or knowledge and so forth. In the Buddhist context, however, wisdom is in a way more organic and more intrinsic to our fundamental intelligence than actually, you could say, the external accumulation of either experience or data. So wisdom is essentially the quality of discerning that is always there. Despite our Buddha nature being veiled, there's always a quality of intelligence that is never entirely obscured. It very often ends up being sort of hijacked by the by the agendas of our insecure ego. But nevertheless, this quality of seeing clearly is then what we refer to as wisdom on a conventional level. In the Buddhist context, on the path of enlightenment, then we speak of wisdom then, well, as that which cuts through deception. And we have, for example, in the image of Manjushri, who holds what we call the sword of wisdom, the sword of prajna. It is that which cuts through the web of confusion. So, for example, if we use the famous example of the rope that's being misperceived as a snake, it's prajna that through looking sees that there actually is no snake and there actually is just a rope. That ability to cut through the initial, you could say, misperception of snake is what then sees, there is no snake, there is rope. So that's really just a quality of intelligence that sees through delusion. So that's what we are cultivating on the path. So we generally talk about that in terms of something that requires that we first listen to the teaching. And this already is major, because most of us, we'd rather just stick with our existing ideas. And we particularly like when other people, they congratulate us on our ideas and say that they agree with us. Or we like to read authors or philosophers who agree with us, they make us feel good. The thing about what we're suggesting in the Buddhist context when we talk about studying the teaching, we're actually going to hear something that goes a bit beyond what we ordinarily come across. And that's where the Buddha comes from, a place of what we can call greater capacity to know, in that the very observer, the very subject, is no longer bound by the limitations of subject and object and the limitations of knowledge. And as such, what the Buddha has to say is very interesting. So that's where we first listen to what the Buddha says, and then we identify where this conflicts with our own understanding, and that's where we have what we call reflection. And we see what it is we actually need to understand in terms of trying to make sense of what the Buddha says. And at that point, then, what the Buddha has said and ourselves, they begins to touch. There's traction taking place. And that's where we begin to own the teaching. That's where it's not just that we've heard a lot of teachings and that's, we have a lot of books and so forth. It's where actually the teaching in our own mind, the Buddha makes a point, and we sort of go, oh, really? And then we kind of go, yeah, he's onto something. And that's where we practice this thing that's called the wisdom of reflection. So the first is the wisdom of hearing, and then there's the wisdom of reflection. And that's where we apply critical condition to see how the teaching fits with ourselves. Finally, then once we have that insight, then understanding what the teaching is about, we apply this through practice. And this consists of, in the Buddhist context, the indispensable practice of allowing sanity to emerge, like we just saw, through the practice of meditation. And it also means integrating this insight in our action, so that our whole being is actually fully freed from its ordinary patterns of confusion. So that's where we both apply, you could say, what we call meditation and also post-meditation. This is all gathered under what we basically just call meditation. So we have these three wisdoms: the wisdom of hearing, the wisdom of reflecting, the wisdom of meditation. So His Holiness says there are many kinds of wisdom. There is, for example, the relative type of wisdom gained through the study of the 5 major traditional sciences. So that's sort of the more conventional, like I was saying before, prajna or wisdom can be sort of used in a conventional sense. And there we have sciences such as languages, logics, crafts, medicine, and philosophy. So this is how it would be understood in the Tibetan sense. Of course, in the modern context, we talk about, say, the hard and soft sciences, the humanities and the sciences and all of that sort of thing. Then His Holiness says there is also the wisdom of working for the benefit of others. And that's more along the lines of what we're saying here, looking at here. When Shantideva says here that all these branches of the doctrine were expounded for the sake of wisdom, he is referring to wisdom that is the realization of emptiness, the true nature of things. This is absolute wisdom. So that's what we're studying when we, that's essentially what we're looking for when in the Buddhist context, we then generate wisdom in terms of hearing, reflecting, and meditating. That's, for example, also in terms of when we say emptiness, that means you could say the object or the field, the knowledge itself. But what requires the realization of emptiness is the wisdom from the subject side. There has to be the insight that takes place from the subject side. So if we're looking at a snake there and thinking looking at a rope and thinking it's a snake, this rope has never changed into snake. It lies there and it's just a rope, but it's the subject that constructs snake onto that rope, and that's where the subject is lacking wisdom. So you could say the nature of reality in and of itself is emptiness, but that doesn't help us if we don't realize that. So that's where we need to understand reality. That's where we need the wisdom, and that's where the beauty of what the Buddha says is not, please think this. The Buddha's enlightenment lies in actually the Buddha's freedom from any supposition or projection or conceptual construction about the nature of reality. All the Buddha is saying is, please look. And that's why in the Buddhist teaching we refer to vipassana as this seeing of reality. The Buddha is not telling us what we should see. The Buddha is telling us how we could see better. And that's where we have, you could say, the nature of the path. But what is being seen, the realization of emptiness, the absence of solidity in both the subject and the object, in the person and in the phenomenal world, that is something that we need to experience. And that's where we would always say, the Buddha says, I can show you the path, but liberation depends on your own efforts. So that's where the Buddha is not going to give us a doctrine. He's not going to give us a dogma. He's not going to give us a mantra. The Buddha is going to encourage us to, on the basis of our own insight, actually access and see for ourselves. He'll show us how it could be. There are helpful ways of doing that. But the realization is something that we actually need to do individually. So that's where the Buddhist project of wisdom is then something that you could say the whole path really leads us to that. And that's the point here in the first verse, where Shantideva then has said, all the branches of the doctrine, the enlightened sage expounded for the sake of wisdom. Therefore, they must cultivate the wisdom who wish to have an end to suffering. So here His Holiness continues, in order to realize emptiness, we do not actually need the first paramitas, and they are not even essential for developing clear insight for vipassana. But as we shall see, they're necessary if we wish to benefit other beings. So of course, vipassana in and of itself is completely without any aspects of, you could say, behavior or anything relative. We, of course, might say that the path is the means that will enable us to have the vipassana, but vipassana itself is completely unconditional. What, however, is we would say is that the Buddha's ability to benefit sentient beings is premised on the accumulation of merit prior to enlightenment. Anyway, with regards to this emptiness nature, His Holiness says, quotes, Nagarjuna says in the 70 verses of emptiness, thus the Buddha said, all things arise from causes and conditions. To view them as real is ignorance. From this arise the 12 interdependent links. Okay, yeah, the 12 links of the interdependence. I think many of you are familiar with this. Anyway, the point is that what we perceive in terms of phenomena, they appear definitely, but there's absolutely they do not imply that they exist really. And if we investigate, we can see they are nothing but phenomena that appear in a particular way. When we begin to see them as real, and that's where we, in ignorance, without examining properly, we begin to attribute, you could say, objective reality to things, then we begin to get caught up in a pattern that generates these artificial constructions that are basic to the condition of samsara, and that is essentially described in the 12 links of interdependent links. So first there's ignorance, then there's impulse, then there's consciousness, and so forth, all the way up to birth, old age, sickness, and death. And essentially we have a continual cycle. So this is where the flaw lies in viewing phenomena as real. So then further it said in the 400 verses by Aryadeva, the seed of existence is consciousness. Phenomena are the field of consciousness. If we see the non-reality of things, we destroy the seed of existence. So if we see how phenomena don't possess the reality we project onto them, we destroy what it is that causes this cycle of suffering. So His Holiness says these passages can be interpreted in various ways, but according to the tradition of Chandrakirti, which is the one to which Shantideva adhered, the teaching of Nagarjuna and his lineage says that to cling to the self as a real entity is to be ignorant, and the ignorance of believing that phenomena truly exist constitutes one of the 12 interdependent links. This gives rise to samsaric existence, which in turn is another of the 12 interdependent links. So the very first link of the very first of the 12 interdependent link is ignorance. It's simply the failing to understand the nature of reality. So that's where the first line here says the seed of existence is consciousness. So this is this ignorance or mindlessness that thinks in terms of a solid phenomena. So then he says the second passage. So okay, this was up here. All things arises from causes and conditions. To view them as real as ignorance. Yeah. So that's the first passage His Holiness is referring to. The second passage states that the seed of this samsaric existence is the kind of consciousness that has objects or phenomena as its field of experience. If these objects are understood to be devoid of ultimate reality, this seed of existence is undermined, and it is completely destroyed when the wisdom of realizing that phenomena are without true existence is perfectly developed. So that is exactly what we do in terms of the cultivation of wisdom. We understand that the attribution of solid self or solidity to what we perceive of as our consciousness, turning that, diminishing it into a whole agenda of me, and also failing to see the nature of reality in terms of the phenomenal world around us, and solidifying them in a way that they actually don't exist. This is essentially where we're at odds with reality, and as a consequence suffer. It's therefore, if we look at all the various Buddhist teachings, and of course on Mondays we're actually doing this from going through the various Buddhist traditions and the Buddhist schools in terms of understanding this nature of emptiness. Whatever tradition there is and whatever path we have, whether it's right from the very, you could say, basis of the path in terms of just approaching the path and beginning to understand it, or if we're looking at the end of the path, teachings like Dzogchen and Mahamudra, all of these teachings, they're premised on first understanding what we would call the lack of inherent existence in self and the phenomenal world. So we're never going to come we're never going to come around, you could say, get around this, you know. If you study Buddhism, you might think, oh, can't I just sort of just have a meditate and sort of calm my mind down a little bit and maybe sort of develop a little bit of compassion and so forth. And of course, yes, it's not like there's some sort of proprietary, you know, imperative, you must learn everything. But enlightenment and what the Buddhist teaching is about is entirely about us awakening fully. And as long as we're still sort of hanging on sleepily to our sort of dream, then we're not really fully awake. And that's why the first thing we do is actually take a hard look at our assumptions about ourself and reality. His Holiness says all schools of Buddhism, with one minor exception, there's a little group called the Samityas of Mampakura, agree that the notion of a personal self, the I, is dependent upon the five aggregates. Okay, now what we mean with that is, let's say I take a stick of incense or a torch and I spin it around, right? And we'll then say, well, there's a ring of fire. There's a solid ring of fire there. And for sure, yes, it looks like there's a ring of fire. But what is it actually? It's something that I am imputing on a torch that's being spun at a particular speed. And that's the same way that we say the self is imputed on the five aggregates. So yes, there's all sorts of things. There's, in terms of the five aggregates, there's the form, there's feeling, there's concept, impulse, etc. All of these things, yes, they're there, but to attribute personal self, the whole me, that's where we're failing. And that's where we can see also that we suffer as a consequence, and we're far better when we're not held by that. But the point really is that it's not just about, do I feel good, do I feel bad? It's actually about looking what is actually really there. And that's where we in all the Buddhist teachings, we're onto this delusion. You know, famously, we talk about no self in the Buddhist teaching, and that's what we mean. So that is on the basis of course, the body and the aspects of the mind, then there is some perception, there's a perception of a self. But that's not at all a given in terms of having body and having mind. So just like the torch that we spin, we're attributing solidity and actually a belief. You know, if there's a child that looks at that and doesn't know that it's really just a torch that's being spun at high speed, they think, wow, there's a real, you know, ring of fire there. And that's where we are when we talk about childish sentient beings. This is actually what we're talking about. So these schools of Buddhism all agree in that sense. They reject the belief in a self that exists independently of these aggregates. So it's not as if the self is something other than the torch that's being spun around, and it's also not the torch itself. There's the self doesn't exist in neither the skandhas or outside it. So it's neither one with nor apart from. It's an imputation on the basis of these aggregates. So His Holiness says the theory of selflessness, however, goes much further than the denial of the personal I. For one must aim to realize that all phenomena are empty or devoid of true existence and have in fact a mode of being that is extremely subtle. So it's not just the subjective, first person subjective experience that we are referring to as being empty, but also the phenomenal world, the objects that we see. They appear, yes, but they actually have no reality. So that's again like we have in the Heart Sutra, like the five skandhas, that there's form, there's feeling, and so on, and they have form is emptiness, emptiness is form, form is no other than emptiness, emptiness is no other than form. In the same way, feeling, perception, impulse, and consciousness are emptiness. So that's where His Holiness here says phenomena, they have a mode of being that is extremely subtle. It is this unity of appearance and emptiness. As we have said, when we see that phenomena or objects of consciousness are devoid of any true entity, the seed of existence is destroyed. The reverse of this understanding is to cling to the belief that things have a solid reality. And this is the definition of ignorance. So that's where we're encouraged to look and give that snake a hard stare and see, in fact, this is just a hallucination on the basis of something that is absolutely not snake. There's just a rope. And similarly, also the whole drama around self and the solidity of the apparent world is entirely imputed on the basis of not looking properly. When we say ignorance, it's also not as if to be free of ignorance, we have to have, we have to be in on a secret or something. It really just means discontinuing the practice of ignoring. So ignoring means we're actually looking away. It's like sometimes like, our friends might want to tell us something and we're like, I don't want to know about it, It's like we choose to ignore. So, that can be fine sometimes, maybe, who knows, but certainly the Buddha is saying, as far as getting to the bottom of suffering, we need to actually look at reality. And that's really all the Buddha wants us to do, to discontinue our proactive practice of ignoring. So His Holiness continues, he says, it is a mistake to believe that those who practice the lower vehicles are unable to free themselves from negative emotions and thereby attain liberation from samsara. Indeed, to think like this is a major breach of the Bodhisattva precepts. When those who follow the path of the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas become arhats, they completely rid themselves of the obscurations engendered by negative emotions. So, of course, all the various paths of the Buddha lead lead us in the direction of enlightenment. Arhat. And this is then taking the Tibetan way of translating this, the Drachompa, means someone who has destroyed the enemies. The enemies refer to the negative emotions, which are vanquished through the practice of the teaching of the fundamental vehicle or Shravakayana. Arhats achieve liberation from the suffering of samsara, but because their realization of emptiness is not perfect, they are unable to remove the subtle veils of attachment to phenomenal reality, which are the obstacles to omniscience. They have yet to enter the Mahayana in order to progress toward the supreme goal of Buddhahood. So for the Arhat, there's still the subtle, like, I'd like peace, and now I have peace. I'd like to remain in peace. But of course, all along there's this I, of course, in a very subtle sense, but nevertheless, there's a contentment with just essentially having arrived at a place which is a cessation of suffering. So we call this Gokpa, or sort of a small nirvana. So that's where there's still at this point there's still the cognitive obscuration that holds on to a subtle sense of self and a subtle sense of solidity with regards to the world. So His Holiness continues, they must also have a realization of emptiness, otherwise they would not be freed from samsara. The wisdom of understanding emptiness, in fact, gives rise to three types of enlightenment, that of the Shravakas, that of the Pratyeka Buddhas, and that of the Bodhisattvas. So that's where the Shravakas have a partial understanding of self of person, the Pratyeka Buddhas have a partial understanding of self of person and phenomena, and it's only the Bodhisattvas who then have a complete understanding of selflessness or emptiness, shunyata altogether. Okay, I think we'll stop at this point. Um, uh, I wonder if the Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of all Buddhists worldwide, or only of those following its Tibetan branch, or generally just the Tibetan branch. But I actually do think there is some organization which is sort of the worldwide Buddhist organization. I think His Holiness was actually, elected president of that for a while, which is actually, I think, really reflects the non-sectarian nature of the Buddhist teaching, because I think it was a Thai organization. So this also goes to show the sort of the general respect there is among the different Buddhist traditions. But no, the Dalai Lama is well, the Dalai Lama actually is interesting. He's not just the spiritual leader of the Tibetans, but he's also their secular leader. And that's where in Tibet you had this thing called Chösi Sungjel, which means the secular and the spiritual in combination. And in a way, that's we sort of in the West, in the modern world, we're sort of very sort of suspicious of making sure that state and church are held apart. But the curious thing, actually, you can't really run a state unless you have wisdom. So the modern assumption is that the church is sort of isn't really connected with reality. They're off on a different sort of tangent. But certainly in a Buddhist sense, enlightenment is very much about being present in reality. And as such, we can see that then that a sage, and very often in Buddhist context, they're the ones who are consulted again and again about completely secular matters. So, and also you can see one, and I'm all, it's my little joke here, but whenever it comes around election time, even the most greedy politician will try to pass him or herself off as a bodhisattva, sort of being a kind person, full of, soft human values, not the hard accountant or sort of the person that's, subject to a lot of lobbying, but somebody who possesses these sort of deep human qualities, so we can see that implicitly, we're sort of all subscribing more or less to the unity of church and state in some way or another. Yeah, yes, some politicians don't try too hard. That's so true. Or they just can't pull it off. Anyway, if we see exercise and good food as looking after our potential to help others, then even that is no longer about ourselves. Exactly. So for sentient beings, please eat well and exercise well. Absolutely. Could you please explore more? Could you please explore more this that has been said, that Vipassana is not dependent on anything relative? Thank you. Well, it's essentially that what we're achieving with the path is something that lies beyond. It's essentially uncovering the ground of our being. So while we, of course, we're dependent on a lot of conditions to actually be able to see the ground of our being, to see reality, then in fact, what really is the actual seeing of reality is this unclouded optics of Vipassana. So that's why we're really just making a point that Vipassana itself is not conditioned. Because if seeing of reality was conditioned, that would mean that once the conditions aren't there anymore, then we wouldn't be able to see reality clearly. So we need to make a point that Vipassana itself, the seeing of reality itself, is something that is unconditional. So it's a subtle point, and of course we're never at any given time. Obviously, in the way of the Bodhisattva, we're talking about all the aspects of the Buddhist path, the paramitas and so forth. So there's no rejecting the path, but it's actually just to make a point of the profundity of wisdom, or the profundity of Vipassana. And then, of course, also we need to make a point that Vipassana, when it's understood as a method, then this is not what we're talking about. And really, the point is more about, you could say, prajna, and even more than prajna, what we call jhana, the wisdom in and of itself. But essentially, the point is that this seeing is unconditional. Yeah. Um, is it only the self or the 12 interdependent links that actually condition? It's all 12. So the 12 links of dependent arising begin with this ignorance, and then on the basis of ignorance, then there's the impulse of the self. And already there, we begin to construct the notions of time and space, subject, object, and then basis we have consciousness, we have the various doors of perceptions, there's wanting, there's holding on, there's becoming, and that's where we then move into new situations, into new lifetimes and so forth. This plays out in our immediate reality, presently within this today, right now, but also plays out in terms of the way that we move through re-embodiment after re-embodiment, lifetime after lifetime. But the way that these 12 work are such that they consolidate and perpetuate this initial ignorance of the self. Okay, someone says this is making sense. So that's good. I'm glad. Um, but you know, the material that we're looking at here is radical. And so there's going to be sort of doubts that sneak in. So we might say, oh, right now I feel really clear about everything. I have a lot of faith in the past. But there should also be a place where we accommodate then sort of, oh, we might have some nagging doubt, and let's face it, we live in a culture where the authorities, you could say the dominant discourse is that of materialism, which is very much constituted by some very, you could say, impressive institutions. And so we might sort of say, well, the people who say the exact opposite of the Buddha, they come with PhDs and massive credentials. They're flown around the world to lecture. They have offices in some impressive sandstone buildings, and they write a lot of books. And everybody I know agrees with them. Yeah. So at that point, then inevitably, when we're practicing the Buddhist path and looking into the teaching here, we need to reflect again. I would say, by the way, keep in account also, you can say that what we're talking about here is 2,500 years of science that actually has been validated through verification again and again. So it's not as if the Buddhists here are some lightweight fly-by-night gurus that are sort of promoting a far-out new idea. It actually is something that has set men and women free for 2 millennia, that has a notable track record of success, and in which actually again and again there has been the confirmation of the validity of what the Buddha had said. But like I say, we would want to, whenever questions come up, we should actually feel okay with having these questions, because the more we ask questions, the more we get answers. The more we get answers, the more we can trust the nature of the path. Yeah. Is wisdom is wisdom of emptiness have to be recognized like in Rigpa through Vipassana? That's a good question. Initially, we do it on the basis of reasoning, and that's the first two wisdoms. That's hearing and thinking critically. And then it needs to be experienced. Yeah, then we need to actually begin to practice, where we're very often habituated to just sort of think along and tag along with our thinking. Their meditation actually is where we sit ourselves down and actually begin to be nakedly present without tagging along unconsciously, mindlessly with the ordinary thoughts. So that's a radical departure. And we might be a little bit, most Buddhists, they're familiar with sort of how sort of over in the corner, there's the meditation cushion that's sitting there sort of waving at them, and they're like, I think I need to go and do something. Yes, I need to attend to this, or I need to attend to that. So there is a nakedness that is possibly uncomfortable. And Trungpa Rinpoche, he makes a very valuable point. He says that discomfort we should take as all, we should expect it and make it the first step on our journey to sitting on the cushion. So, but anyway, briefly, yes, the first we need to study, you could say, arrive at some understanding, and then we need to, then this wisdom of emptiness is cultivated through the practice of meditation experience. What readings on the 12 links? Oh, there's a lot. And look, next time, somebody remind me. But anyway, I'll promise to bring along sort of a little overview of the 12 links next time. They might be good to have. Yeah, so we can just briefly go over them. Can we attain wisdom without any engagement with the 5 major traditional sciences? Yes, we can. They're seen as being part of being educated, cultured, and so forth. But at the same time, we have many stories in the Buddhist teachings on persons that had very little education, who again just were able to recognize this undiluted condition, maybe just through a few sort of, you can say circumstances, teachings, whatever. But yeah, we can do. We can do without the 5 major traditional sciences. Yeah, language, crafts, the arts, logic, poetry, what have you. Yeah. By the way, answering again the questions on the 12 links. The 12 links, that's sort of a traditional way of presenting how ignorance comes about. But to make it more intuitive and experiential, I would warmly, to understand where ego and so forth comes about, I always warmly recommend a chapter in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, and it's called The Development of Ego. Development of Ego in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. So profound. So brilliant in terms of it's very intuitive, and also, yes, covers all bases. Just a single chapter, really again reflects on the absolute brilliance of Trungpa Rinpoche. See you later. Somebody's saying goodbye. The experience of selflessness is then realizing emptiness. Yes, yeah. Emptiness is a funny word, and the shunyata really implies just the ness quality of things. So it's like, it's like empty, empty like. But it doesn't mean that there's nothing there. I mean, we're always making this point, but I don't think it can be said enough. It doesn't mean things go away, but it means the very nature of everything we experience and realize is such that it cannot be grasped. And as such, it's not even at odds with, you could say, materialist science. What materialist science is about is really just understanding how the phenomenal world plays out. But what the point here is that we, in our individual confusion, attribute a solidity to the phenomenal world and ourselves. That's not based on anything. There are the appearances, the firebrand, right? So it's not strange that it looks like there's a ring of fire. But if we investigate, then we can see there's nothing there. And the point of doing that is we suffer on the basis of misapprehending reality. So that's where so that's where it's important for us to analyze and understand how things don't possess a solid self or a solid reality. That's the journey then, where we first have an understanding, then we experience, and then we realize. How it feels to feel emptiness. Can it be explained in words? Try and look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Try and look at sages. It comes with rosy cheeks. It comes with a good sense of humor. It comes with kindness. It comes with bliss. So if you want to see know what does it feel like, I would say look at the sages. Look at the people who've had a slice of that stuff. You say, hey, I want what she's having. Can we live in a society without imputation and its language? Well, what is implicit here is that we can live in a society where what is implicit with emptiness is that there's openness. So it's very much conducive to a well-functioning society. It's about non-aggression. It's about lack of territoriality. It's about consideration for others. So it's essential for society. When society works, it's in a way due to a bit of emptiness trickling down. Can contemplating our interconnected nature lead one to emptiness, true nature? Absolutely. You're very much encouraged to do that. Yeah. We have the famous example of the Pratyeka Buddha, the person who wants to do it all on by him or herself. So they go to a charnel ground, they look at a bone, they'll say, where does this bone come from? Well, it comes from somebody who died. Where does somebody who died come from? Well, that comes from somebody who was born. Where does birth comes from? Well, that comes from an individual subjectivity that's seeking. Where does such seeking comes from? Well, it comes from the whole craving. Where does craving come from? Well, it comes from the notion of object, subject, and object. Where does that come from? Well, etc. And so they trace it all the way back to ignorance. So famously, the 12 links of dependent arising, we talk about that in the way that it arises, and we also talk about how to reverse it. And that's essentially where we analyze, contemplate the interconnectedness of appearance and go trace it back to its origin, which is ignorance. So someone says then, so is His Holiness, I guess you mean the Dalai Lama, interacting with the smile of knowing language is just a skillful means to navigate in an imputed world? It's a compassionate way of navigating in an imputed world, and it's also effortless. His Holiness is not just thinking, I'm going to smile so I can navigate successfully. He can't help love the world. He can't help care for sentient beings. And so this is really this actually is not just that it's that things work out, but it works out joyfully, spontaneously. Varela uses the term groundless, approach from the perspective of cognitive science and color vision, which may be more approachable. Yes, very much. Groundlessness is very much what we're interested in embracing here. And of course, sometimes we might think, well, groundlessness, gosh, I would be very worried about that. Trungpa Rinpoche talks about us having the carpet pulled out from under our feet and being afraid of that groundless experience. And then he says, we might be afraid when the carpet is pulled from under our feet, but then we find that we've been on rock, solid rock all the time. So there's nothing to be fearful of in terms of this groundlessness. Or Elizabeth Matis Namgyal was quoting Herbert Gunther, who talks about open dimensionality and so forth. But anyway, thank you very much. And it's very helpful that we sort of have these cross-disciplinary input. Yes, much appreciated. So in cognitive, the question here is Varela uses the term groundless, approach from the perspective of cognitive science and color vision, which may be more approachable. Thank you. When we hear touch the earth, how do you think it relates to emptiness? Well, bhumisparsha, touching the earth like the Buddha's gesture, well, that is being in touch with reality. So emptiness doesn't mean sort of everything disappears, but it's more that we're in touch with reality. We're not, you could say, misinterpreting reality. It's actually coming into touch with it. And that's where we're relinquishing our ordinary confusion. So that's where we need to be willing to be open to meet with reality. And that's where we need to let go of our stubborn projections. Reality is such that it cannot be grasped, but that's not necessarily a negative thing. And as long as we fail to recognize that, we suffer. So when His Holiness is talking to someone who is fearing a snake, he is using the term snake in a very different way to that of the fearful person who is ignorant of the imputed snakeness. Well, yes, he will skillfully, first of all, be suggesting that the person who's suffering actually takes a hard look at the snake. And he has to sort of, because he has to convince the person that it would be good to look, to actually begin to look in the first place. So he might talk about the values of looking. He might even talk about the sort of, maybe even he'll start talking about how snakes can be very nice or something like that. But you know, all of this, what we call expedient teachings, are intended to actually free the person from the fear. So it's not just about getting the equation right, but it really comes from a place of compassion. Then recognizing that the nature itself is actually good as it is. There actually is no snake. Yeah. Okay. I think we'll conclude at this point. So thank you very much. We'll be continuing next time. And we're coming towards the end of the book. And after that, we'll be looking a little bit, actually continuing what we're discussing here in a work called The Sword of Wisdom by Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche, which I warmly recommend, because this really also will, so many of the questions we're having right now, they come from a place of actually wanting to understand really getting to the bottom of how we understand and validate this teaching on wisdom. Like Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche says, you know, when a bit like His Holiness was saying here, you have compassion, ethics, and wisdom. They're out going for a ride. Necessarily, wisdom has to be behind the wheel. Yeah? So wisdom is important. Okay. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night, realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning. May we cross the ocean of existence in that light. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Yes, the study of the Sword of Wisdom will be the same time, yeah, on Wednesdays, yeah.